Imagine a world where the cure for a fever, a headache, or even a broken heart is to be systematically drained of your own blood. Imagine a doctor, his sleeves rolled up, not with a stethoscope or a syringe of antibiotics, but with a polished steel lancet, ready to open a vein. This isn't a scene from a horror film. For over 2.5 millennia, this was the reality of medicine. It was called bloodletting, and it was the single most common medical procedure performed in the history of the world. From the banks of the Nile to the battlefields of the American Civil War, physicians believed that by spilling a patient's blood, they were saving their life. It was a practice built on a sophisticated theory, endorsed by the greatest minds of their time and accepted by millions. It was also, in all likelihood, one of the deadliest medical traditions ever conceived. How did this happen? How did an idea so fundamentally wrong persist for so long, weaving itself into the very fabric of Western civilization? This is the story of the cure that killed, a tale of logic and madness, of tradition and revolution, and of the enduring human quest to conquer disease, even when the treatment is worse than the illness itself. Our story begins not in a doctor's office, but in the realm of ideas, with a beautiful, elegant, and catastrophically wrong theory of the human body. To understand why anyone would willingly let a doctor bleed them, we must travel back to ancient Greece, to the time of Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine. Around the 4th century BC, Greek thinkers were obsessed with finding order in the universe. They believed the entire cosmos was composed of 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. It seemed perfectly logical, then, that the human body, a microcosm of the universe, must be made of similar stuff. This idea gave birth to the theory of the 4 humours. The body, they proposed, was a vessel containing 4 essential fluids, or humours. First, there was blood, associated with the element of air, the season of spring, and a sanguine or cheerful temperament. Then came phlegm, linked to water, winter, and a phlegmatic or calm disposition. Third was yellow bile, connected to fire, summer, and a choleric or fiery personality. And finally, there was black bile, the mysterious humour tied to earth, autumn, and a melancholic or sad nature. According to this doctrine, health was not the absence of germs, which were completely unknown, but a state of perfect balance among these 4 humours. Sickness, therefore, was simply an imbalance. Too much phlegm caused a cough or a cold. An excess of yellow bile led to anger and liver problems. Too much black bile brought on depression. And an excess of blood, a condition known as plethora, was thought to cause everything from fevers and nosebleeds to seizures and madness. The logic was simple, intuitive, and dangerously compelling. If disease is an excess of a humour, the cure is to remove it. You could induce vomiting to purge bile or sweating to release phlegm. But the most direct and seemingly effective method was to target the most visible and vital humour of all, the blood. While the Greeks laid the foundation, it was a Roman physician who would cement bloodletting as medical dogma for the next 1,500 years. His name was Galen of Pergamon. Active in the 2nd century AD, Galen was a brilliant anatomist, a prolific writer, and the personal physician to Roman emperors. He was the undisputed master of medicine, and his word was law. Galen took the theory of humours and supercharged it. He wrote hundreds of treatises, meticulously describing which vein to cut for which ailment, how much blood to take, and what signs to look for in the drained blood itself. Was it dark and thick? That meant it was full of black bile. Was it frothy? An excess of the sanguine humour. He created a complete, self-contained system for every symptom. There was a humoral explanation, and for nearly every explanation, bloodletting was a potential answer. Galen's authority was so absolute that to challenge him was to challenge medicine itself. His writings became the core curriculum in every medical university in Europe for centuries, and so the lancet, the phlegm, and the leech became as essential to a doctor as a hammer is to a carpenter. As the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered the Middle Ages, Galen's teachings were preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, who then reintroduced them to a reawakening Europe. Medicine became a strange mix of Galenic theory and Christian theology. Sickness was both a humoral imbalance and a sign of sin. Bloodletting, therefore, was both a physical and spiritual cleansing. But the university-trained physicians who read Galen in Latin and debated theory considered the actual act of cutting into a body to be beneath them. It was manual labor, a trade, not a science. This created a peculiar division of labor. The physician would diagnose the patient, perhaps consulting complex astrological charts. The stars, after all, were believed to influence the humors. An almanac might feature the zodiac man, a diagram showing which astrological sign governed which part of the body. You wouldn't want to bleed the feet when the moon was in Pisces, for example. It was all part of the intricate, sacred knowledge. Once the diagnosis was made and the auspicious time chosen, the physician would write a prescription and send the patient not to a pharmacy, but to a craftsman. This was the era of the barber-surgeon. The iconic red and white striped pole we still see today is a direct relic of this time. The red symbolized blood, the white symbolized bandages, and the pole itself represented the staff a patient would grip to make their veins bulge. Barber-surgeons were the jacks of all trades of medieval healthcare. They could give you a shave, pull a tooth, set a broken bone, and most importantly, bleed you. They had the tools and the stomach for the job. The primary tool was the lancet, a small, pointed, double-edged knife. A skilled surgeon could flick it open, find a prominent vein, usually the median cubital in the crook of the arm, and make a swift, clean incision. The blood would be collected in a bowl, its quantity measured, its quality examined. For more generalized bleeding, they might use a scarificator. This was a terrifying-looking brass box containing multiple hidden blades. When a trigger was pressed, the blades would shoot out, making a dozen shallow cuts at once. A heated glass cup would then be placed over the cuts. As the air inside the cup cooled, it created a vacuum, sucking the bad blood out of the body. This was known as wet cupping, but perhaps the most famous method was leeching. The medicinal leech, Pharaohs medicinalis Phae, was nature's perfect phlebotomist. These creatures were farmed by the millions in ponds across Europe. A doctor would apply the leech to the patient's skin. The leech would attach itself with its 3 jaws, each lined with 100 tiny teeth, and inject a cocktail of chemicals into the wound. This included an anesthetic, so the bite was painless, and a powerful anticoagulant called hirudin, which kept the blood flowing freely. The leech would drink its fill, swelling up to 10 times its original size, before dropping off. For centuries, this was the state of the art. A monk suffering from a fever would be bled in his monastery. A knight wounded in battle would be bled to prevent inflammation. A noble lady feeling faint would be bled to calm her humors. The practice was everywhere, a constant, bloody rhythm in the symphony of life and death, and it wasn't just for the sick, healthy people were bled regularly as a preventative measure, a sort of seasonal tuning of the body. They would be bled in the spring to curb the sanguine humor's exuberance, or in the autumn to ward off melancholy. It was as normal as going to church. The logic seemed unshakable. When a patient with a high fever was bled, they would often feel cooler and calmer as their blood pressure dropped. When someone with a raging headache was bled, the pain might temporarily subside. These immediate, tangible effects were powerful confirmation that the treatment was working. If the patient recovered, the doctor was a hero. The bleeding had worked. If the patient died, well, the illness was simply too powerful. The doctor had done everything they could. No one ever thought to question whether the cure itself might have been the cause of death. As Europe moved from the Renaissance into the Age of Enlightenment, you might expect this ancient practice to fade in the light of new reason. But the opposite happened. Bloodletting entered its most aggressive and terrifying phase. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the practice became more heroic, more dramatic. Doctors weren't just removing a few ounces of blood, they were draining pints. In France, it became such a fad that critics claimed it was turning the country into a nation of pale, listless invalids. But nowhere was this heroic medicine more enthusiastically embraced than in the young, bold, and newly independent United States of America. Its most famous champion was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the most respected physicians in the country. Rush believed that all diseases were ultimately one disease, an excessive excitement and tension in the blood vessels. His solution was simple and brutal: bleed the patient and bleed them aggressively. He recommended removing vast quantities of blood until the patient fainted, a state known as syncope. This, he believed, was the sign that the tension in the arteries had been broken and the body could begin to heal. During a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, Rush and his followers bled their patients relentlessly. Many died, but Rush remained convinced of his methods, blaming any failures on starting the treatment too late or not being aggressive enough. His influence was immense, and his philosophy of heroic depletion would dominate American medicine for decades. And it is here that we arrive at the most famous and tragic case in the long history of bloodletting, the death of George Washington. On a cold December day in 1799, the 67-year-old former president woke up with a sore throat. He had been out riding on his estate in the snow and rain. By the next day, he was struggling to breathe and speak. His condition was likely acute epiglottitis, a severe swelling of the tissue at the back of the throat that can rapidly block the airway. It's a serious condition even today, but back then it was a death sentence. Washington, a firm believer in medicine, called for help. First, he asked his estate overseer, who was skilled at bleeding horses, to bleed him. Then the doctors arrived. For the next 12 hours, a team of the finest physicians in Virginia attended to the nation's hero, and they did what they had been trained to do. They followed the teachings of Galen and the heroic principles of Benjamin Rush. They bled him, then they bled him again, and again. In total, they removed an estimated 5 to 9 pints of blood from his body. That is roughly 40 to 50% of an adult male's total blood volume. As the day wore on, Washington grew weaker and weaker. His voice faded to a whisper. His breathing became more labored. The man who had survived the brutal winters of the Revolutionary War was being drained of his life, not by the infection in his throat, but by the very hands of those trying to save him. Late that evening, George Washington died. His doctors were baffled. They had applied the most powerful and trusted therapy in their arsenal, and it had failed. For us, looking back, the cause seems tragically clear. While the throat infection was the initial problem, the massive blood loss almost certainly sent him into hypovolemic shock, a state where the heart can no longer pump enough blood to the body's organs. The cure had become the killer. Washington's death sent a shudder through the medical community, but incredibly, it didn't stop the practice. The power of a 2,000-year-old tradition was too strong, yet the seeds of doubt were being sown. A revolution was quietly beginning, not with a lancet, but with a simple observation. In 1628, an English physician named William Harvey published a book that would change everything. After years of meticulous dissection and experimentation, he demonstrated that blood circulates through the body in a closed loop, pumped by the heart. This was a direct contradiction of Galen's theory, which held that blood was continuously produced by the liver and consumed by the body's tissues like fuel in a fire. Harvey's discovery was monumental, but its implications were slow to sink in. For another 2 centuries, doctors continued to bleed patients, even though the theoretical foundation for it had crumbled. The real turning point came not from a brilliant theorist, but from a methodical French physician named Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis in the 1830s. Louis did something revolutionary. He decided to count. He began studying patients with pneumonia at a Parisian hospital, meticulously recording their symptoms, the treatments they received, and whether they lived or died. He gathered data on a group of patients who were bled early and aggressively, and compared them to a group who were bled later or not at all. The results, published in 1836, were a bombshell. The numbers showed clear as day that bloodletting had no positive effect on the outcome of pneumonia. In fact, his data suggested it made things worse. This was the birth of clinical statistics, of evidence-based medicine for the first time. Bloodletting wasn't being challenged by a competing theory, but by cold, hard facts. Still, the old ways died hard. Doctors argued that Lewis's numbers didn't capture the nuances of individual cases. They relied on their own experience, their own anecdotes, and the powerful confirmation bias that had sustained the practice for centuries. For a doctor facing a desperately ill patient with no other effective treatments available, doing something something as violent as bloodletting, felt infinitely better than doing nothing. The practice was a powerful ritual, a demonstration of the doctor's authority and concern. To abandon it would be to admit impotence. The final death blow to bloodletting came not from one source, but from a cascade of scientific breakthroughs in the latter half of the 19th century. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch developed germ theory, proving that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, not by imbalanced humors. The entire philosophical framework of Galenic medicine, which had stood for nearly 2 millennia, collapsed simultaneously. New diagnostic tools like the stethoscope and the thermometer allowed doctors to understand what was happening inside the body with greater precision. And most importantly, new and effective treatments began to emerge. Anesthetics made surgery less horrific. Aspirin could control fevers. The first glimmerings of pharmacology offered real alternatives to bleeding, purging, and blistering. By the dawn of the 20th century, bloodletting had all but vanished from mainstream medicine. It became a relic, a symbol of a dark and ignorant age. The lancet was retired to the museum shelf, a testament to medical folly. The story, it seemed, was over. But here, our journey takes an unexpected turn, because in a strange and ironic twist of fate, bloodletting never entirely disappeared. It just went into hiding, waiting for science to catch up to it. Today, if you walk into a modern hospital, you can still find patients being